In the depths of the Hokkaido mountains, where the wind howled through the snow-covered pines and ice hung like frozen tears from the edges of rooftops, a legend as old as winter itself lived. The inhabitants of the small village of Yukihara whispered her name with a mix of fear and reverence: Yuki Onna, the woman of snow. Hideo, a young lumberjack in his early 20s, grew up hearing stories about the mysterious entity that roamed the snowy forests during the coldest and darkest nights. His grandmother, Akiko, would tell him tales of travelers who vanished in snowstorms, leaving behind only footprints that ended abruptly, as if taken by the icy wind itself. Yuki Onna is as beautiful as the first snow of winter, Akiko used to say, her wrinkled eyes sparkling in the light of the fireplace. But her heart is as cold as the eternal ice of the mountains. She lures men with her supernatural beauty, only to steal their last breath with a frozen kiss. Hideo listened to these stories with a mix of fascination and skepticism. He was a practical man, accustomed to the harshness of life in the mountains. To him, the real danger of winter lay in the biting cold, treacherous avalanches, and hungry wolves that sometimes descended from the heights in search of food. Yet, as the winter of that year approached, something felt different. The air carried an intensity of cold greater than normal, and heavy clouds on the horizon promised a storm unlike any the village had faced before. The village elders gathered in the communal house, their wrinkled faces marked by concern. Hideo, being one of the strongest men in the community, was called to the meeting. "This is not an ordinary winter," declared old Takeshi, the leader of the council. His white beard trembled as he spoke, his voice laden with apprehension. "The signs are everywhere. The birds left early this year, the bears retreated to their dens ahead of time, and even the oldest trees seem to shrink against the wind." Murmurs of agreement swept through the room. Hideo observed the faces around him, noting the fear in the eyes of his neighbors and friends. "And there is more," Takeshi continued, lowering his voice as if fearing to be overheard by unwanted ears. "There have been sightings. A pale figure wandering through the forest at night. Footprints that appear and vanish in the fresh snow. Some say they heard a feminine voice singing a sad melody during the last storm." A shiver ran down Hideo's spine. His grandmother's stories echoed in his mind, gaining a new dimension of reality. "Yuki Onna," someone whispered, and the name spread through the room like a chilling wind. Takeshi nodded gravely. "We fear so. And if the legends are correct, her presence heralds a winter unlike any other, a winter that may very well be our last." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with fear and uncertainty. Hideo felt the gazes shift to him, the young strong man in whom the village often placed its hopes. "What can we do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear beginning to settle in his heart. Takeshi sighed deeply. "We need to prepare as never before, stockpile food, reinforce our homes against the cold, and above all, stay united. And," he hesitated for a moment, "we need someone to investigate these sightings, to find out if we are truly facing something supernatural." Again, all eyes turned to Hideo. He felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a heavy blanket of snow. "I will go," he said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "I will venture into the mountains and uncover the truth behind these rumors." A murmur of relief and concern rippled through the assembly. Takeshi placed a wrinkled hand on Hideo's shoulder. "May the gods protect you, young Hideo," he said solemnly. "And remember, if you encounter Yuki Onna, do not look into her eyes. They say they hold all the beauty and all the terror of eternal winter." As Hideo left the meeting, he felt the weight of his mission settle upon him. Outside, the wind howled among the trees, and the first snowflakes began to fall from the darkening sky. Somewhere deep within the snowy forest, he knew, the truth awaited him. A truth as ancient as the mountains, as mysterious as the snow itself. And with that truth, perhaps, the fate of the entire village of Yukihara. The next morning, Hideo woke up before sunrise. The air inside his small cabin was frigid, his breath forming clouds of vapor in front of his face. He quickly dressed, putting on layer after layer of warm clothing. Wool shirts, a thick fur-lined coat, sturdy pants, and waterproof boots. As he prepared, his thoughts wandered to the task ahead. He was a man of the forest, accustomed to its dangers and secrets, but this was different. He was about to venture into the unknown, in search of a legend that, until yesterday, he considered merely a story to scare children. A gentle knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was his grandmother, Akiko, her wrinkled face marked by concern. "Hideo, my dear," she said, her voice trembling. "Do you really have to go?" He smiled gently at her, taking her wrinkled hands in his. "Yes, Grandma. The village needs me. I need to find out what is happening." Akiko nodded slowly, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She turned and picked up something wrapped in cloth. "Take this," she said, handing the bundle to Hideo. "It is an amulet that belonged to your grandfather. He wore it through many harsh winters. May it protect you as well." Hideo unwrapped the cloth, revealing a small jade pendant carved in the shape of a snowflake. He put it around his neck, feeling a strange warmth emanating from it, despite the cold surrounding him. "Thank you, Grandma," he said, embracing her tightly. "I will return, I promise." With one last look at his cabin, Hideo set out. The village was still asleep, its houses covered with a blanket of fresh snow. Only a few footprints disturbed the immaculate white surface, his own and those of some nocturnal animals. As he moved away from the village and approached the forest, the snow began to fall more heavily. The flakes danced in the air, propelled by a wind that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. Hideo pulled his hood over his head and continued walking. The forest welcomed him with an almost supernatural silence. The tall pines stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. The only sound was the crunching of his boots in the snow and his labored breath. Hideo walked for hours, climbing higher and higher into the mountains. The cold intensified with each step, seeping into his bones despite the many layers of clothing. He began to understand why so many travelers succumbed to the winter in these mountains. As the day progressed, the storm worsened. The wind howled between the trees, lifting swirling clouds of snow that obscured his vision. Hideo struggled to maintain his direction, relying on his years of experience in the forest to avoid getting lost. Then he saw her. In the midst of the white curtain of the storm, a pale figure seemed to materialize. It was a woman, her skin as white as the snow around her, her long black hair billowing in the wind like ribbons of dark silk. She wore a white kimono that seemed to blend with the snow, making it difficult to tell where the fabric ended and the storm began. Hideo's heart raced. Could it be? Was she Yuki Onna? The woman looked directly at him, her eyes a pale blue that was almost white. Hideo felt hypnotized, unable to look away. Takeshi's warning echoed in his mind. Do not look into her eyes. But it was too late. A smile spread across the woman's lips, as cold and beautiful as a winter dawn. She extended a pale hand toward him, her long, graceful fingers like ice crystals. "Come," she whispered, her voice like the tinkling of ice bells. "Come with me, Hideo." Hideo took a step toward her, then another. He knew he should flee, that he should turn and run back to the safety of the village. But his feet felt like they had a mind of their own, carrying him closer to the beautiful and terrible apparition. As he approached, he felt the cold intensify. It was not just the chill of winter, but a supernatural cold that seemed to drain all heat from his body. His fingers and lips began to turn blue, his breath coming out in increasingly dense clouds. The snow woman smiled wider, revealing teeth that shone like ice crystals. She leaned closer to Hideo, her cold lips mere inches from his. At that moment, the amulet around his neck began to warm. The heat spread through his chest, pushing back the supernatural cold. Hideo blinked, as if waking from a dream. With a shout, he pulled away from Yuki Onna. His eyes, once clouded by enchantment, now clearly saw the danger he was in. The expression on Yuki Onna's face shifted from a seductive smile to a mask of fury. The wind around her intensified, turning the storm into a true whirlwind of snow and ice. "How dare you reject me?" she screamed, her voice now like the roar of an avalanche. "You will pay for this, mortal!" Hideo didn't wait to hear more. He turned and ran, fighting against the wind and snow that seemed determined to stop him. Behind him, he could hear the furious cry of Yuki Onna and the howling of the storm that she commanded. He ran like he had never run before, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. Snow-covered branches lashed at his face, leaving cuts that burned with the cold. But he dared not stop, dared not look back. For how long he ran, Hideo could not say. It may have been minutes or hours. Time seemed meaningless in that supernatural storm. All he knew was that he had to keep moving, to keep fighting against the cold and fatigue that threatened to overtake him. Finally, when his legs could bear him no longer, Hideo saw a light ahead. It was a cave, illuminated by the warm glow of a fire. With his last strength, he crawled inside. Inside the cave, the roar of the storm faded to a distant moan. Hideo fell to his knees, gasping and shivering. He looked toward the cave's entrance, half expecting to see the pale figure of Yuki Onna appear at any moment. But she did not come. Slowly, the warmth of the fire began to penetrate his soaked clothing, bringing life back to his frozen limbs. It was then that Hideo noticed he was not alone in the cave. Sitting across the campfire was an old woman. Her face was a map of deep wrinkles, her dark eyes gleaming with ancient wisdom. She wore simple but warm clothing, and her gnarled hands held a carved wooden staff. "Welcome, young traveler," she said, her voice surprisingly strong for someone of her age. "You were fortunate to find this refuge." Hideo, still gasping and trembling, looked at the woman with a mix of relief and distrust. After his encounter with Yuki Onna, he was not ready to trust strangers found on the mountain. Who are you?" he managed to ask between ragged breaths. The old woman smiled, the wrinkles around her eyes deepening. "I am Yuki. Some call me the guardian of the mountain, and you, young one, have just escaped an encounter with a very ancient and dangerous force." Hideo felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "You know about Yuki Onna?" Yuki nodded gravely. "Oh yes, I know her well. She is as old as these mountains, as relentless as winter itself. But you, young one, did something remarkable today. You resisted her enchantment." Hideo instinctively touched the amulet around his neck. "It was this amulet. It saved me." The old woman tilted her head, her eyes focusing on the jade pendant. "Ah, I see you carry the protection of your ancestors. That is good. You will need all the help you can get in the days to come." Hideo frowned, puzzled. "What do you mean? What days are to come?" Yuki sighed deeply, the sound reminiscent of the wind blowing through the pines. "Yuki Onna is not just a threat to lost travelers, young one. She is a spirit of winter, and her presence so close to your village is no coincidence. She brings with her a winter like no other, a winter that could last forever." Hideo's heart sank. The old woman's words confirmed the village elder's worst fears. But why? Why would she do this? "Yuki Onna was not always like this," Yuki said, her gaze drifting into the flames of the fire. "There was a time when she was a guardian of these mountains, bringing the necessary winter for the balance of the seasons. But something changed. Something made her bitter and cruel." Hideo leaned forward, intrigued despite his fear. "What happened?" Yuki looked at him, her dark eyes filled with sadness. "Love, young one. Love happened. Many years ago, Yuki Onna fell in love with a mortal, a young lumberjack, not much different from you. But mortals are ephemeral, their lives as brief as a snowflake falling. When he died, Yuki Onna's heart froze with pain. Since then, she has sought to fill the void in her heart by freezing everything around her." Hideo fell silent for a moment, absorbing the story. Finally, he spoke. "So what can we do? How can we save our village?" The old Yuki smiled, a glimmer of approval in her eyes. "Ah, that is the right question, young one. The answer is not simple. Yuki Onna cannot be defeated by force. Her power is too great, too ancient. But she can be remembered." "Remembered?" Hideo repeated, confused. "Yes," Yuki said, nodding. "Remembered for who she was before the pain froze her heart. Remembered for the love she once felt. Not just for a mortal, but for all the creatures of these mountains." The old woman rose, moving with surprising grace for someone her age. She walked to a small recess in the cave wall and retrieved an object wrapped in cloth. "This," she said, unwrapping the object, "is an ancient mirror. It is said to have the power to reflect not only the outward appearance, but the true nature of whoever looks into it." Hideo looked at the mirror. It was a beautifully crafted piece, its frame adorned with intricate carvings of snowflakes and pine branches. The surface of the mirror glowed with a faint bluish light. "You must take this mirror to Yuki Onna," Yuki said, handing the object to Hideo. "Make her look into it. Perhaps by seeing her true self, she will remember who she was and what she is meant to be." Hideo carefully took the mirror, feeling its weight both physical and metaphorical. "And if it doesn't work?" Yuki's face turned somber. "Then, young one, I fear your village, and perhaps all this valley, is doomed to an eternal winter. Hideo swallowed hard, the weight of his mission falling upon him like an avalanche. He looked at the mirror in his hands and then back at old Yuki. "How do you know all this?" he asked suddenly. "Who are you really?" A mysterious smile played on the old woman's lips. "I am someone who has lived through many winters, young one. Someone who knows well the secrets of these mountains. Now rest. Tomorrow, your journey will continue, and you will need all your strength." With those words, old Yuki moved to the back of the cave, disappearing into the shadows. Hideo was left alone with the crackling fire, the distant howl of the wind outside, and the weight of the magical mirror in his hands. As he settled down to sleep, his thoughts were filled with images of the beautiful and terrible Yuki Onna, the wrinkled and wise face of old Yuki, and the fate of his village now resting in his hands. Sleep came slowly, populated by dreams of eternal snow and eyes as blue as ice. Dawn arrived cold and gray, the sunlight barely piercing through the heavy snow clouds. Hideo woke up feeling rested but apprehensive. The cave was empty. There was no sign of the mysterious old woman, Yuki. He checked his supplies, adjusted his clothing, and held the magical mirror tightly. With one last look at the refuge that had protected him during the night, Hideo stepped out to face the storm. The wind hit him immediately, cutting and relentless. The snow fell in heavy curtains, obscuring his vision beyond a few meters. But Hideo was a son of these mountains. He knew their paths, their moods, their traps. With steely determination, he began his journey up the mountain. Hours passed, each step a struggle against the wind and snow. The cold seeped into his bones, but the amulet around his neck glowed with a comforting warmth, keeping the worst of the storm at bay. It was when he reached a clearing that he saw her again. Yuki Onna stood in the center of the clearing, her ethereal figure almost merging with the snow around her. Her long black hair billowed in the wind, and her ice-blue eyes sparkled with a supernatural light. "So, you have returned, mortal," she said, her voice like the tinkling of ice crystals. "You are brave, or foolish." Hideo swallowed hard, gathering all his courage. "I came to talk to you, Yuki Onna." A cold smile played on her lips. "Talk? And what could an ephemeral mortal like you have to say to me?" "I know about your past," Hideo said, taking a step forward. "I know you haven't always been like this, that once you were a guardian of these mountains, bringing the necessary winter for the balance of the seasons." Yuki Onna's smile vanished, replaced by an expression of fury. "You know nothing, mortal. You cannot understand eternity, solitude, pain." The wind picked up, snow swirling around them in a frenzy. Hideo struggled to maintain his balance, gripping the mirror with all his strength. "I know that you once loved," he shouted against the howling wind. "I know that loss froze your heart, but that is not what he would have wanted for you." For a moment, the fury in Yuki Onna's eyes wavered, replaced by something that could have been pain. "You know nothing about him," she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the wind. It was now or never. Hideo raised the mirror, pointing it at Yuki Onna. "Look," he pleaded. "Look and remember who you truly are." Yuki Onna gazed into the mirror, her eyes widening in surprise. For a long moment she stood still, her gaze fixed on the reflective surface. Hideo watched, hardly daring to breathe, as a myriad of emotions crossed Yuki Onna's face. Surprise, recognition, pain, and finally, something that looked almost like regret. I remember," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I remember who I was." Slowly, the storm around them began to subside. The snowflakes fell more gently now, dancing in the air like feathers. "I was the guardian of these mountains," Yuki Onna continued, her voice gaining strength. "I brought winter, but also the promise of spring that would follow. I loved all the creatures of these lands." Hideo nodded encouragingly. "Yes, that is who you were. That is what you can still be." Yuki Onna looked at him, her blue eyes now filled with an ancient sadness. "But I have caused so much pain, so much destruction. How can I turn back?" "It is never too late to do the right thing," Hideo said, recalling the words his grandmother used to say. "The past cannot be changed, but the future is still unwritten." Yuki Onna remained silent for a long moment, her gaze returning to the mirror. Finally she nodded, a single frozen tear sliding down her cheek. "You are right, young mortal," she said softly. "It is time for me to remember my true purpose." With those words, she raised her arms. The wind picked up again, but this time it was not violent or cold. It was a gentle breeze, carrying with it the scent of pine trees and the distant promise of spring. The snow around them began to stir, swirling in a soft whirlwind. Hideo watched in awe as Yuki Onna herself seemed to merge with the dancing snow. "Thank you, brave young one," her voice echoed in the air, growing distant. "You reminded me of who I am. Now I will fulfill my duty as the guardian of these mountains once more." And with that, she vanished, completely merging with the softly falling snow. Hideo stood in the clearing for a long time, hardly believing what he had just witnessed. Slowly, he noticed a change in the air. The biting cold had lessened, replaced by a refreshing coolness. The snow still fell, but now it was soft and gentle, no longer the furious storm it had been before. With his heart full of hope, Hideo began his journey back to the village. He knew he had an incredible story to tell, a story of an ancient legend redeemed, of a tame winter, and of a courage that melted even the coldest heart. As he descended the mountain, he could see the first rays of sunlight beginning to break through the clouds. Spring, he knew, was not far away, and when it came, it would be sweeter than ever. Years had passed, and the story of Hideo and his encounter with Yuki Onna became a legend in the village of Yukihara. Each winter, when the snow began to fall, the villagers gathered to share the tale of the young lumberjack who faced the spirit of winter and restored balance to the mountains. Hideo, now an older and wiser man, often sat with the village children, recounting his adventure. He spoke of the terrible beauty of Yuki Onna, the enigmatic wisdom of the old Yuki, who had never been seen again after that night in the cave, and the power of love and compassion to melt even the coldest heart. The winters in Yukihara remained harsh, as they always had in the mountains, but now, even on the coldest days, the villagers could feel a certain gentleness in the wind, as if the very snow was hugging them instead of threatening them. Epilogue continued, the cycle of the seasons. Sometimes during full moon nights when the snow fell gently, some swore they saw an ethereal figure dancing among the flakes. A woman with black hair and pale skin, her white kimono blending with the snow around her. But unlike the old tales, this vision did not bring fear. It brought a sense of peace and reverence. In his later years, Hideo often climbed to the clearing where he had last encountered Yuki Onna. There, he would sit in silence, watching the dance of the snowflakes and remembering that fateful day that changed not only his life, but also the fate of the entire village. On one of those visits, when winter was at its peak, Hideo received a surprise. While sitting on his usual rock, he noticed a subtle change in the air. The snow, which had been falling softly, began to swirl in a gentle vortex. From the center of this whirlwind, a familiar figure emerged. Yuki Onna stood before him, as beautiful and ethereal as he remembered. But there was a change in her. Her eyes, once cold as ice, now glowed with ancient wisdom and profound compassion. "Hello, brave young one," she said, her voice like the soft tinkling of ice bells. "Though you are no longer so young now." Hideo smiled, feeling the weight of the years in his bones. "Yuki Onna," he replied with reverence, "it is an honor to see you again." Yuki Onna approached, her bare feet leaving no marks on the snow. "I came to thank you," she said softly, "to thank you for reminding me of who I was, of who I was meant to be." Hideo shook his head humbly. "I merely showed you the mirror. The change came from within you." Yuki Onna smiled, a smile that carried the promise of spring after a long winter. "Even so, your courage and compassion made a difference. Look around you, Hideo. See what your actions have brought." Hideo looked. The forest surrounding him was covered in snow, but it was not dead and cold snow. It was alive, bright, full of promise. He could see green buds starting to emerge in places, ready to bloom as soon as winter passed. "The balance has been restored," Yuki Onna continued. "Winter comes, but now it carries with it the promise of spring. Life and death, cold and warmth, all have their place in the great cycle." Hideo nodded, feeling a profound peace settle over him. "And you?" he asked. "Have you found peace?" Yuki Onna looked up at the sky, where the snowflakes danced in the air. "I have found my purpose again," she said. "I bring winter, but not out of anger or pain. I bring it because it is necessary, because it is part of the balance of nature. She turned to Hideo, her blue eyes shining with a supernatural light. And what about you, Hideo? Have you found your peace? Hideo smiled, feeling the warmth of the amulet against his chest, the same amulet that had protected him so many years ago. Yes, he responded simply. I have found it. Yuki Onna nodded, satisfied. Then our journey is complete. Remember, Hideo, even when winter seems the coldest and darkest, spring will always come. It is the cycle of life, the cycle of the seasons. With those words, she began to fade, merging once again with the falling snow. But before she disappeared completely, she said one last thing. Thank you, Hideo, for teaching me that even the coldest heart can be warmed by the heat of compassion. And then she was gone, leaving only snowflakes dancing in the air where she had been. Hideo lingered in the clearing for a long time afterward, contemplating all he had learned and experienced. When he finally rose to return to the village, he felt a renewal in his spirit, a new appreciation for the beauty and necessity of all seasons of life. And so, the legend of Yuki Onna in Yukihara changed. She was no longer seen as a threat to be feared, but as a guardian to be respected, a vital part of the eternal cycle of the seasons. Sometimes, on winter nights when the snow fell softly and the full moon shone bright in the sky, villagers swore they could hear a gentle melody in the wind, the song of Yuki Onna, no longer a tune of loneliness and pain, but a song of balance, renewal, and the eternal dance of the seasons. And Hideo, even in his last days, smiled upon hearing that song, knowing he had played a role in transforming a legend and restoring the natural balance. He knew that even when his own winter arrived, it would merely be part of a larger cycle, and that spring would always come again.